Welcome to Libertas Europae. Today we're going to talk about Guns, Germs and Steel by Jared Diamond, winner of the 1998 Pulitzer Prize and probably the most popular explanation for the European miracle. If you're new to the channel, I invite you to join me as we explore and celebrate European history and culture, and you can do that by subscribing down below. So the European miracle is the astonishing way in which Europeans have come to dominate the world over the last couple of centuries, and how they've created unprecedented levels of wealth and technological progress along the way. I talked about the European miracle in the very first video I made on this channel, linked up here. And in that video, I went over various different possible explanations for the European miracle, including guns, germs, and steel, which I touched upon briefly there, and also laid out 3 different modes of explaining why a particular people, a particular country, a particular region succeeds or fails. And the first of these is people-centric explanations. Explanations that look at the people's biology, at their culture, at their mores, at their norms. The second is institutional explanations. Explanations looking at governments, at the legal system, at economic systems, and so on. And then the third would be environmental. That is looking at the geography, the climate, the flora, the fauna, and so on. And guns, germs, and steel squarely falls into that third category. Diamond's explanation is focused entirely around geography and domesticated animals and plants. So what I'm going to do in this video is to give an overview of the book and lay out Diamond's central arguments. But unfortunately, Guns, Germs and Steel, even though it is very interesting, very fascinating, is a deeply flawed book. So in the next video, I'm going to be critically evaluating Diamond's book and pointing out many of the factual errors, leaps in logic, questionable scholarly conduct, and also, of course, talking about the areas where the book gets things right, and there definitely are those too. So what is Guns, Germs and Steel all about? Well, Diamond opens the book by recounting a conversation he had with a New Guinean politician named Yali, who asks him the following question. Why is it that you white people developed so much cargo and brought it to New Guinea, but we black people had little cargo of our own? And by cargo here he means material goods, stuff, wealth, and by black people he's talking about Melanesians like himself. He's not talking about Sub-Saharan Africans, who we usually mean by black people. Melanesians do have dark skin, but they're not at all related to Sub-Saharan Africans. And since Diamond didn't have a very adequate reply at the time, but he's thought about it ever since, Guns, Germs and Steel is sort of his belated answer to Yali. That is, he wants to explain the broad historical patterns of why certain regions and people groups have succeeded so much more than others. Diamond illustrates this disparity by giving an account of the Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire. In particular, he's talking about the Battle of Cajamarca in 1532, in which Pizarro led a group of only 168 Spaniards in an ambush and an attack on the Incan Emperor Atahualpa, and they captured the emperor, killing thousands of his attendants and guards, and throwing Atahualpa's army of tens of thousands into disarray. And they did all of that without losing a single man. So how come this battle was so lopsided? And while it's true that most of the confrontations between Native Americans and Europeans were not quite as one-sided, they were still plenty one-sided. It was still the Europeans who managed to conquer the Americas in record time. While the obvious causes for the European success are the European edge in technology, in economics, in culture, Europeans had weapons made of steel, they had armor made of steel, they had gunpowder weapons, although at that point the gunpowder weapons were still fairly primitive. But still, the Native Americans that they faced were fighting with weapons made of stone and wood, which were not very effective against European armor. And then additionally, the Europeans carried deadly diseases that spread even ahead of the actual Europeans themselves, causing epidemics, decimating the populations, and leaving Native American societies fatally weakened and ripe for European conquest. So those factors are the guns, germs, and steel of the title. But what Diamond is more interested in is not to look at these proximate causes, but rather look at ultimate causes for this great imbalance. And he claims that most people, even if they do not want to admit it, implicitly believe as this sort of racist notion that the reason for European success lies in the Europeans themselves as a people, that they are in some way superior to the rest of the world. And his mission is to dispel this notion and to offer a superior environmental explanation. Diamond says that the conquest of the New World by the Old in 1492 was already a done deal. It was already inevitable. Nothing really could have prevented it. So really, if we want to look at the causes, we have to look earlier. We have to look at why Eurasia and North Africa was so far ahead of the rest of the world at the dawn of the modern era at around 1500. And what Diamond often does in this book is to sort of lump Eurasia and North Africa together. That makes a certain amount of sense because there's always been these connections by trade, by war, by migration between Eurasia and North Africa. But Diamond often just uses the word Eurasia to stand in for both, which is a bit confusing. So instead I'm going to talk about Greater Eurasia when I mean Eurasia plus North Africa. So the core of Diamond's theory is domestication of plants and animals. And it just so happened that the inhabitants of Greater Eurasia enjoyed far greater access to efficient crops and domesticable animals, and the inhabitants of other regions only had a very limited array of domesticated animals and plants at their disposal. So the core of Diamond's theory is to look at domesticated animals and plants, and he says that Greater Eurasia has a great advantage here, in that they have a wide array of efficient crops and domesticated animals at their disposal, whereas the rest of the world had to make do with a lot less. They had a much more limited array of crops and animals, and those that they did domesticate, it usually happened much later than in Eurasia. So the Eurasians basically had thousands of years of a head start. And the disparity is especially severe when it comes to large mammals, and especially large mammals that can be used for work, that can be used to ride, that can be used to pull wagons or plows. There, Eurasia has all the best animals. It has horses, it has cattle, it has asses, it has camels, it has yaks, various other species, whereas the rest of the world has basically nothing. The only exception is the llama, which was confined to the Andes region. Other than that, zilch. And this abundance of domesticated species obviously implies an advantage for Greater Eurasia in terms of agriculture, in terms of transportation, in terms of warfare. But that's not all. Domesticated animals are also responsible for this imbalance in germs. And Diamond says that all of the deadliest infectious diseases that humans have suffered from historically are actually evolved from diseases affecting animals, which then mutated through the millennia of close contact that humans had with their domesticated animals, and then came to infect humans. And this, of course, was a rather mixed blessing. These diseases over the millennia killed millions and millions of people, but also they meant that the inhabitants of Greater Eurasia developed resistances to these diseases through antibodies and genetic adaptations, which of course people who did not live in close contact with domesticated animals did not. And so when germ-ridden Europeans encountered relatively germ-free Native Americans were felled by disease, whereas the Europeans came away mostly unscathed. And this of course raises the question of why is it that Greater Eurasia gets all the best plants and animals, whereas the rest of the world is left with scraps? Is it because maybe Eurasians were smarter or more industrious and thus better able to domesticate plants and animals? Well, no, says Diamond. That can't be it, because he says that hunter-gatherers have a very extensive knowledge about the local flora and fauna. They know all the useful plants, they know all the local animals. So virtually all plants and animals that were actually suitable and worthwhile for domestication were in fact domesticated. But it turns out most species just simply are not suitable for domestication, and it just happened that Greater Eurasia has a vastly larger number of suitable species for domestication. And as additional support for this point, Diamond brings up the fact that no major new species has been domesticated in the last couple of centuries. There have been a couple of plants and animals that have been recently domesticated, but none of them are particularly important in terms of their economic impact. And this implies that the people outside of Greater Eurasia didn't miss any very beneficial species for domestication, there just happened to be none. But it does seem like an awfully big and convenient coincidence that Eurasia just happened to have most of the good plants and virtually all of the good animals. How does Diamond explain this remarkable imbalance? So a major part of the explanation of the lack of riding in draft animals outside Greater Eurasia is that much of the megafauna of the Americas and especially Oceania went extinct in the late Pleistocene. And Diamond argues that this is due to human influence, that humans came into these environments with these animals that previously hadn't encountered humans, who were not aware that humans, despite their small size and relatively harmless look, are actually extremely deadly hunters and therefore should be greatly feared. And because these animals lacked this fear that the animals of Greater Eurasia had already drilled into them by many thousands and thousands of years of evolution alongside humans who were gradually getting better and better at hunting. But now these humans who were already very proficient hunters came into this environment where the animals were not adept at dealing with humans, didn't have the appropriate fear, and so these made very easy pickings, and humans just eradicated a lot of these big species by overhunting. And so, for example, horses and camels are actually native to North America, or at least their wild ancestors are, but they went extinct shortly after the first humans showed up. Another important factor is size. Eurasia is the largest continent, and especially it gets even larger if we include North Africa, and so obviously just by pure chance we'd expect it to have more suitable species. And to amplify this, we have to look at the major axes of the continents. If you look at Eurasia, it has an east-west axis primarily. The distance east-west is much greater than the distance north-south. Whereas if you look at the Americas, it's the other way around. You have a north-south axis, and east-west is a fairly small distance. And similarly, if you look at Africa, it also, Diamond says, has a north-south axis rather than an east-west axis. And this is important because plants and animals more easily spread east-west than north-south, because as long as you move just east-west, you're staying in the same latitude, which means you have a similar climate, and that makes it a lot easier to spread domesticated crops and animals over long distances. So in Eurasia, agriculture spreads very quickly from the original centers in the Fertile Crescent and in China, whereas in the Americas, for example, you have some very efficient crops being domesticated. You have something like potatoes and maize, two of the most important staple crops of humanity today, but they spread very slowly because they had to overcome this north-south axis. So in the last major part of the book, Diamond takes us on a tour around the world in 5 chapters, where he applies his theory to the histories of Australia and New Guinea, China, Polynesia, the Americas, and Africa. And he concludes in each case with the observation that the differences in outcomes of the natives of these regions are due to environment and not due to the people themselves. And to give you a feel for this, the last paragraph of the chapter on Africa, which is also the last paragraph of the main part of the book, is quite representative of these 5 chapters. In short, Europe's colonization of Africa had nothing to do with differences between European and African peoples themselves, as white racists assume. Rather, it was due to accidents of geography and biogeography, in particular to the continent's different areas, axes, and suites of wild plant and animal species. That is, the different historical trajectories of Europe and Africa stem ultimately from differences in real estate. But hold on a second, what about Europe? Diamond really has only answered half of Yali's question, namely why his people are poor. But why is it you white people who have so much cargo rather than, say, the Chinese or the Indians? Diamond gives a very brief answer to this in his epilogue, and then he somewhat expands on that a little bit in his afterword, which was added in 2003. He says that China was too centralized, which meant that all you needed to stop progress was one bad emperor, and meanwhile Europe was divided into all these small and medium-sized principalities and kingdoms who were nevertheless united by a shared culture, shared language, and this meant if some state becomes too conservative to set in its ways and opposes innovation, pioneers and innovators can simply move to a different country that's just 100 miles this way and resume their innovation. And then once the country falls behind, it really has to adopt innovations of its neighbors. Otherwise, it's going to get outcompeted and possibly even conquered. And of course, Diamond also has a geographic explanation for that. He says that Europe was more decentralized because it has more large islands and peninsulas, and China was so centralized because it was not carved up as much by mountains, and it had these very well-connected navigable river systems. And this great connectedness initially gave China an advantage, but then eventually led it to fall behind Europe. So this is Diamond's grand theory, and if you felt like, wait a minute, there's some problems with the theory, then your instincts are entirely right. There are indeed some massive problems, which I'm going to address in the upcoming video. And if you're from the future, this will take you to the video. If you're stuck here with me in the boring past, this link will take you to another video of mine. Alternatively, you can also look at this video, which is an overview of different explanations about the European miracle, and I'll see you there.